Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm here with Lance S. Bush, philosopher with a focus on moral anti-real, or how do you describe it? I forget
I
what
would
you
say
say
meta
about it.
ethics and moral
Metaethics.
psychology.
Thank you. But you also have an interest in this subject of determinism and free will. So we decided to have a chat on this.
Yeah.
And Lance, for those of you who you've probably seen Lance on this channel before, and I'm really excited because Lance is starting his own YouTube channel. It's called Lance Independent. And actually, we're going to talk about this issue for a little while. And then we're going to go over to Lance's channel and he's going to have people join the stream and talk to him. So there's already a link pinned at the top of this chat. That is not for this stream. That is for the stream on Lance's channel later on. When we finish our talk, then we're going to go over there on his channel. And hopefully, if you guys are watching, please subscribe to Lance's channel. And there's a link in the chat as well as a link to Lance's blog. And so I'm excited about this. All right. So where should we start, Lance?
You tell me.
Okay. Well, I believe in free will. So I think you might have some pushback for me. So maybe we should just start by talking about like how do I conceive of free will? And then we can discuss whether or not you think that that is feasible. So I think that free will is the ability to choose between options, and you yourself are the source of those choices. You have the ability to choose otherwise, and you can be influenced by things that are from the outside, but that there's something in you, not randomness. Randomness can have a factor in it, but there's also something in you that assists you in making the choices. Maybe it's your will, I don't know, but I mean not it's something intangible. So what do you think about that definition?
I'm a little concerned that there's a certain degree of underspecificity in it. So you're like, there's something
Okay.
in there, but well, what is it and how does it function? And is it something that is causally determined? Is that relevant? Certain portions of this description seem mysterious. Like there's sort of just blank spots in it.
Okay. Do you think other people have a better definition for free will? Like a more specified definition of free will?
I mean, people can give more specific definitions of free will, but that wouldn't necessarily make them better. Like someone could give a very detailed description of a tuna sandwich and call that free will, but it wouldn't be a better description because we're not talking about tuna sandwiches, right? So, there's more specific and then there's better, but better is this kind of normatively loaded term. I could flesh that out with definitions that I think are better at capturing what I think people are generally trying to capture when they talk about free will. In that sense, I think that what you've described does a fairly good job of that. At least one advantage of the approach that you're of like not being fully specific is that it's fairly sort of theoretically neutral with respect to different conceptions of free will. So like when some of the stuff that you've stated in describing it resonates with different sorts of positions that are in the academic literature on free will. But I don't know where you stand with respect to the sort of traditional disputes that would emerge in the philosophical literature. So I don't know if you call yourself a compatibilist or an incompatibilist, or whether you don't even like that framework or don't care about it. So one way to try to locate like a good definition from a sort of academic analytic philosophy perspective would be to try to locate it within the space of the different positions as they've been laid out in that field. Now, the thing is, I'm not really a fan of the way analytic philosophers approach and frame these problems in the first place. And so it could be good relative to the attitudes of analytic philosophers, but I'm not sure that they really frame free will in way, or their ways of framing it are ways I would endorse or think are good. I don't know if that's a helpful response though.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure where to go with this because I kind of want to, like, maybe we could discuss the compatibilist versus incompatibilist. Yeah, that might be a good place to start. So I talked to Danny about this, by the way, so he kind of explained to me. Maybe I should just repeat it back as I understand it, and then you can correct me if I'm like off on that.
Okay.
Okay. So the way I understand it is that there's like, okay, the incompatibilist could either and by the way, the way that I talked to Danny about this is I used that little blurb that you sent me about the different positions, and I said, Danny, explain this to me. So what he said is that incompatibilist, it's about the framework that you're using, whether you think that free will can be compatible with determinism or not. Like, and so if you're an incompatibilist, you're saying, no, this is kind of like an either or, right? Like it's either free will or it's causally determined, or determinism. Is that a right way of understanding it?
Yeah, that's how I would frame it. So
Okay.
So what compatibilism is the view that it's possible to have both free will and determinism at the same time, that it's sort of logically compatible. It's possible to have both simultaneously. And then
Right.
incompatibilism, as you said, it's one or the other. But just because you're a compatibilist, all compatibilism commits you to is that it's possible to have both free will and determinism. It doesn't actually commit you to determinism being true or having free will. You could think we don't have either of those. You could think we do have both of them. You could think we have one but not the other. In practice, if a person says they're a compatibilist, that's usually a shorthand for saying, I am a compatibilist, and I think both free will and determinism are like they're like determinism is true and we have free will. They might say, I don't really know whether determinism is true, but it doesn't matter if it is because we could have free will either way. So they might endorse views like that. It would be a little strange for someone to say, I'm a compatibilist, but I don't believe in free will. But there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. What they would mean is, I don't think determinism is incompatible with free will, but I don't think we have free will anyway.
Okay, and so where are you standing right now on this?
This is typical of most of these things. I don't fit into any of these categories.
Okay.
So I think that a fundamental issue in many philosophical disputes is an underspecificity in what's being stated and an overemphasis on sort of trying to conceptualize terms and concepts as if they refer to distinct things independent of the terms we use to refer to them, without realizing that the way that we use terms, we often mean or refer to different things. What I'm saying, what I'm trying to get at there is that I think if we get clear on what's being articulated by different sorts of accounts, that many of the central issues surrounding free will would dissolve as either conceptual confusions or convoluted and confused ways of using terminology. And so what I think ends up happening is that well-specified questions about free will either resolve in, sure, we have that kind of free will, sure, we have that, or it's a type of free will, no, we don't have that, and their answers end up just not being very interesting. So I don't endorse the view that there's like a correct account of free will. I think that there are different conceptions, and it would be sort of just trivially the case that we don't have some and we do have others.
Okay. Well, and I just want to stop right here and let people know again, for those who weren't here at the beginning, we're going to be Lance is going to be inviting people to join his stream after we've talked for a little bit. Lance has started a channel called Lance Independent, and to just get started on his channel, we're going to move over there for an open stream. So if you have thoughts on free will, determinism, whatever your perspective is, you're welcome to come and share it and kind of discuss it with Lance. So hold on to your ideas, your questions, and I'm not going to be paying that much attention to the chat, because when I'm having a discussion like this, it's really hard for me to pay attention to both things. So, okay. Now, okay. Let me see here. Where do we want to go with this? But you believe in determinism of some sort, right? Because I've heard you say this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more inclined to think determinism is likely to be true than not. But I also, I mean, you could call me a compatibilist if you want, but I think it would be incompatible with incompatibilist accounts of free will, and it would be compatible with compatibilist accounts of free will. I don't think that there's a correct account of free will. So there's not a way for me to give like a definitive, it's this or it's that kind of answer. So yeah, I just can't, I don't take a stand on these issues. Roughly, if you wanted to put a label on the position, I would call myself a quietist about it, which is to say that once I think that we sort of turn over all the conceptual and terminological soil, we'll find that there's not really anything there. And that the entire conversation has been a catastrophic waste of time, which is a pretty pessimistic way to talk about it, but.
Okay, but wait a minute. I remember having a conversation with you before, and I was like, okay, so like I have the experience of free will. Like I feel that I am free to make choices in one way or the other. And you said, well, I feel the opposite. My intuition tells me that things are determined. Like,
well, but so I make decisions. I make choices.
right.
I could choose to do one thing or another thing. I don't think that it would indicate that I have free will or not.
Okay.
Like, so like you could say, look, we don't have free will, but does that mean that you think people don't make choices or don't feel like they make choices? I mean, I feel like I make choices and I do make choices and I can decide on one thing or another thing. If I'm a determinist, I'm going to say that which decision I end up making would be predictable in principle or is determined by antecedent causes, but I'm still making a choice.
Okay. Okay. So do you think those causes are all of those causes like unchangeable?
I think more likely than not. Yeah. So I think it's probably the case that all the events that occur in the world are determined by antecedent causes. That basically, if you knew the initial state of the universe, it would entail like everything that happens by necessity after that.
Okay. See, and to me, this is a very strange view because it's like, I mean, it doesn't it take away responsibility for choices?
So that's what I see as the fundamental question related to like that's really at the heart of free will. I remember seeing a definition somewhere. I don't know if it was the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something, but it said that free will is whatever is needed for moral responsibility. And I think so. I don't think that's in the Stanford Encyclopedia's account of free will anymore. If it ever was there, I don't remember where I saw that exactly. But that entry in the encyclopedia goes on to talk about the importance of free will for praise and blame and these sorts of things. And this is something that you'll find throughout the philosophical literature on free will, that much of the concern about whether we don't have free will is this sort of existential or practical concern that if we don't have free will, like, what's the point? You can't have love, you can't have creativity. No one's actually creative. Whether you're creative or not is determined by antecedent conditions. You can't really love anybody because whether you love them or not is not voluntary. You don't have any control over it. And so the idea here is that it's like, you have to let everybody out of prison because they're not responsible for their actions. And, basically society would collapse if there were no free will, or at least you would like lose a sense of purpose and meaning.
Thank you. Yes. Well said. This is exactly how I feel. So
right, but
what's your response to that? What's your response?
What is it that we're lacking that means life has no purpose and people aren't responsible for their actions? Because if you just say free will, like, well, what is that?
Well, it's basically saying that, well, if you just say free will, well, that means that, I mean, as my definition of it is you have the option. You have an option today whether to do good or bad. And if you're saying, I have no option, like everything is caused, then that basically gives people permission to act in any way that they feel in the moment without taking responsibility for it.
I don't know that follows from that. What do you mean it gives them permission? How does that give them permission?
Okay, okay, I'll tell you, right? Okay, I'll tell you. Look, if I really believed right now, if I thought the world was everything was determined and there was nothing I could do about it, I'm probably not going to do my laundry tomorrow, okay? Because I don't want to do my laundry. And so I'm just probably going to think, well, okay, it doesn't matter, because even if I thought it was right to do my laundry, I can't change the way I am, and I just don't like doing my laundry. So, I mean, why should I do that?
Well, that's not any sort of logical entailment of free will. That would be a sort of psychological negative reaction to it. Someone could react negatively to, I don't want the sun to rise tomorrow. If the sun rises tomorrow, I'm not going to do my laundry. Nothing about the fact that your choices are determined by antecedent conditions. Why should that lead you to not do your laundry? I don't get it. I mean, that could just be a fact about your psychology, but it's not some sort of like logical entailment of the fact that determinism is true, that you shouldn't do your laundry, or that there's
Why wouldn't it be, though? Because what would be the difference between doing my laundry and not doing my laundry?
Well, that's would be a question for you to answer. Presumably, I mean, you have a bunch of dirty, smelly clothes.
Right, but
you probably don't want dirty smell.
I can't help it. I can't help those dirty smell. I can't help it. There's nothing I can do.
Well, you could do laundry.
But I don't have an option, because I just, I don't have any options. Everything's determined, right? So
you got to be clear.
Maybe it was determined that I not do my laundry.
Determinism isn't fatalism. So what it does not mean is that your laundry is going to get washed or not washed, regardless of what decisions you make. That would be some kind of like fatalistic position where certain sorts of events will necessarily occur. But that determinism doesn't mean that certain sorts of events will necessarily occur regardless of what you do. It's not fate whether your laundry will get washed or not. Whether your laundry gets washed or not depends on whether you or somebody washes the laundry. It still depends on that. And so there's still these causal dependency relations.
And isn't that dependent on someone making the choice to do laundry?
Sure. Yes.
Yes. So, I mean,
choices are just part of the deterministic causal stream.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's like rocks roll down hills. People make choices. There's just two types of events that occur. They're both determined. Okay. Or maybe they're not. I don't know. Maybe if they're not determined, then I would assume that there would be like random events, but I don't know that randomness is going to rescue moral responsibility or make it the case that now you have a reason to wash your laundry.
Okay, but like you mentioned, let's go on to what you said about the criminals. We need to let all the criminals out of jail because they didn't have, it was determined that they were going to, commit these crimes. So they're not really responsible for them.
Yeah. Why would you let them out of jail?
Because how can they be held responsible when there's these causal events?
It depends what you mean by responsibility. So there's different conceptions of moral responsibility. You could draw a non-moral types of responsibility. So you could say that, if someone murdered somebody, they're causally responsible for the person's death. And you might also say that they're morally responsible in certain sorts of sort of non-desert-based respects. But the kind of responsibility a lot of people want to preserve is called a desert-based moral responsibility. And the idea behind that is that to the extent that a person's responsible, this could be for good or bad things, like the person does a heroic action, that the punishments or rewards that follow that they should receive as a result of their actions, they should receive them because they deserve them. So if a person murders someone, they should go to prison because they deserve to be punished. But you don't have to think that the only reason it would make sense or the only justification for putting people in prison is because they deserve prison. You could put people in prison for deterrence reasons. You could put people in prison for rehabilitation. I'm not necessarily endorsing the prison system as it is. I'm just saying that to the extent that you favor some practical way of treating people's punishment for wrongdoing, this could be just, censuring your children for misbehaving or criticizing someone. Like, it doesn't have to be in such a severe context. In all of these cases of praise and blame, the only thing you could do it for the practical reasons. There doesn't have to be some sort of like metaphysically weighty notion that people genuinely deserve this or that thing. So with respect to letting people out of prison, let's say it's like violent, dangerous, psychopathic murderers that are saying, hey, as soon as you let me out, I'm just going to kill as many people as possible or whatever. I wouldn't let them out because I don't want them to do that.
Right.
That
okay.
Seems like a good reason to me. I don't want them to go out and kill people.
I have to put up this comment because it's too funny. Big Thing Flying Wayne says, Becky, your free will laundry theory needs some more time in the dryer. Oh my goodness. Okay. So Floyd says, don't we lock up dangerous chemicals and weapons? We can do the same things for beings that were determined to be dangerous as well. Okay. That sounds like the point you were making, right? Like that we can, it doesn't matter whether it was determined or not. We can still do it as a preventative measure, right?
Like, and part of the purpose of, and the thing is, there are compatibilist conceptions of free will. I don't endorse them, but they can make sense of what it is we're trying to do with respect to the people's agency. Because you might think like, well, if one person accidentally causes harm and another person intentionally causes harm, they were both determined. So why don't you put them both in prison? And that, I think, is not thinking through the practical consequences of why you might not want to imprison someone for accidental harm, but you might want to, punish someone for intentional harm, which is, a few things. One would be deterrence. If people know that they could be punished if they intentionally cause harm, to the extent that they're responsive to reasons, like, the threat of punishment in this case, that could deter them from doing it. You can't really deter people with the threat of punishment from accidentally causing harm. I mean, maybe you could cause people to be less negligent or to be more careful with their actions. So to a certain extent, maybe you could. But you could, like, the purpose of that sort of thing is typically to deter intentional action. So action can still be intentional, even if it's determined. And typically, when it comes to evaluating a person's guilt or responsibility, you would take into consideration the motivations, the sort of psychological factors that are associated with why they committed the action. So if a person, sometimes a person might give a good explanation for, why they performed, like, they did something, like they lied, right? Let's say someone lied to you, and you find out that the reason they lied was like to save someone's life. Okay, that's a good reason for them to lie if it's not a super important thing. But if they lied because they're selfish and mean, and they just wanted to manipulate you, it's a bad reason to lie. And I wouldn't consider the first reason would still be good and the second reason would still be bad, even if you're a determinist. And it's the same thing with moral anti-realism. You don't have to believe there's objective moral facts. You don't have to believe there's free will to evaluate actions as good or bad or right or wrong, or have preferences for how you want the world to be.
Okay, so do you feel that there is some sort of freedom? Like, you believe in determinism, but do you believe that there is some sort of freedom?
Sure. So like some of our actions are free from outside coercion. So like I'm choosing to talk to you right now. No one's making me talk to you. There's not a person off the camera, like, holding a sledgehammer, like ready to get me if I don't keep talking. So like I'm not being coerced. So in that sense, like if by free action, we mean uncoerced action, sure. Yeah. People. So and this is what I'm saying, like, you just have to be specific about what you're saying. So some of the ways in which our actions can be free, and you could say that we have free will, would be some of the decisions we make are uncoerced and some of them aren't. The ones that are uncoerced, we could say to that extent, they were free actions. Some of our actions stem from our goals or desires. We identify with and value committing the action in question, and other actions we don't. And if someone forces you to do a thing you don't want to do, like if someone robs you and you have to give them your wallet, you're not voluntarily giving them your wallet. So you could say in that case, you're acting under duress. You're not acting out of free will. But if you donate money to someone because you want to, then you're identifying with the cause of the action. You value that action. The action is downstream causally of your goals and desires. And then in that sense, you could say that person had free will. Another respect in which people have free will is that people could be said to have differential degrees in different circumstances of their ability to deliberate about their actions. So a person, imagine you have two cases where a person plans out a murder and a person is, it's in the middle of the night and, they're startled and they swing the lamp by the bed and they hit somebody and they injure the person. They didn't have time to deliberate through their actions. If it's a reflex, we would treat that agentially as different from an action someone spent months or weeks plotting out. And so in that respect, you could say that the person that plots out an action rather than reacting reflexively is acting with a greater degree of free will. And in all of those senses, I'm using free will in slightly different ways. And we do have those types of free will. And in some cases, we're exercising that free will, and sometimes we don't. But we have all those. And there's nothing like metaphysically weird about them. In none of those cases are they threatened by whether determinism is true or not. It simply doesn't matter whether determinism is true. So in that sense, yeah, sure, we have all those kinds of things.
Okay, but that person who's plotting and planning and preparing a knife, preparing all these plans. Now, could it be otherwise?
It depends what you mean by could it be otherwise.
Could they choose otherwise than the course that they have planned and actually carry out? Could they do otherwise?
So I think that there's ambiguity in the question. My inclination, if I just had to give an answer, would be no. So I see reality as basically like, this is not a good metaphor because it's not really my conception of the way time works, but it's like a movie reel. Like whatever's going to happen is just going to happen. Now that includes choices and decisions. So it doesn't mean that events in the 10th scene will happen no matter what a person chooses in the events in scene 8 or whatever. It's that the events in scene 8 determine the events in scene 9, which determine the events in scene 10. So the whole thing follows this sort of causal chain where each event in one scene is determined by the previous event. So it's not like certain events are inevitable regardless of what happens prior. So that wouldn't be the view. And if by could have done otherwise, you mean under identical circumstances in which everything is held constant, could they have happened differently? Then I think the answer is no. So one way to put it would be like, could you rewind a movie? Do people even use rewind anymore? I don't know. You go back in the movie and play it again. Are different events going to happen? No. So could the person in the movie have done something different? In one sense, no. But what you could conceive of could have done differently in a way that's not presupposing some sort of like causal determinism, like given causal determinism. You could conceive of it in a way like, had they had different goals and desires, could they have done differently? And then the answer would be yes, something like that. I don't really endorse a particular view of could have done otherwise, because again, it's one of these cases where I don't think that the phrase or the term itself has some sort of intrinsic or single rigid meaning. We just have to be clear about what we mean when we use that sort of phrase. So on certain construals, yes, and on some, no.
Okay, well, but I like the way that you put it with the movie. So it's like it's not changeable on those circumstances. But if I say, well, that's not how I see it, Lance, I don't think it's a movie that would be if we went back, it would be exactly the same. I believe that there is something that allows for the person to choose otherwise with the same set of circumstances. So attack it.
What am I supposed to attack?
Well, you disagree with that, right?
Well, I mean, are you just rejecting determinism?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if determinism is true or not. Maybe it's not. I mean, I think it probably is, but I'm not really going to have like a metaphysical dispute, like about how do we interpret quantum mechanics? Because like, am I supposed to resolve the dispute about how to interpret quantum mechanics in favor of like the many worlds or the like Bohm interpretation over the Copenhagen interpretation? I don't understand physics well enough to do that. So I couldn't really resolve whether determinism or some type of indeterminacy or would be true, such that certain sorts of events, at least at the quantum level, if not at some macro level, are random. But I don't know what the third alternative to those would be. And so if you're just rejecting determinism, I guess what I would say is I just don't know whether that's relevant or not. So if you say I don't accept determinism, I'd say, okay, don't accept it.
Okay.
Does that mean that we have free will? And if so, what do you mean by that? So if you don't think events are determined, do you think that some of them or all of them are random? Presumably you don't think all events are random.
No. So I have to say in advance, I've like gotten into this discussion with Danny and he always corners me and then I don't have a way out. But I somehow, I think that like it's not random there are influences from outside of us, but in some way we can process those influences, and those don't have to determine what we do. But it's not it. I don't know. Maybe
it's not random. It's not determined. It's some third option. Unfortunately, one thing I can say is Danny probably understands this way better than me. So I don't read a ton of stuff on like libertarian conceptions of free will. And I wouldn't be able to articulate what proponents of libertarian free will think about these issues. Definitely not at a level that they would agree with. So that puts me at a limitation with respect to evaluating this particular topic in some respects. And it looks like you might have libertarian leanings because it doesn't sound like you're a big fan of the compatibilist approaches. So even though I don't think, I'm not an expert on free will, what I have studied is the psychology of free will and attempts to measure whether non-philosophers endorse any particular conception of free will. So I could speak quite a bit about that. But
yeah,
the philosophy of free will is, well, I mean, I could, but that's maybe not as relevant to our discussion.
That might be fun though. Talk about it.
I'm happy to talk about that, but we're still on this topic.
Okay. Then let me ask the topic that I put as the title. So am I determined to be a believer in free will, and are you determined to be skeptical about it?
So that it's a kind of question where I can't resolve that question here. So I suspect some kind of deterministic account is probably correct. It may not be correct, but I just personally, I don't see how that's especially relevant to the kinds of considerations that matter to me. But there may be considerations that matter to you that somehow turn on whether determinism is true. But it's not clear to me what those are. I do have some concerns, which is one of them is that, as you can see from my position on this, I don't really think that there are huge stakes here. Maybe someone could argue that there are and that I'm motivated in some way. But it looks to me like both proponents of libertarian conceptions of free will and compatibilists seem to me to have some stakes here, because concerns will be like, well, if we don't have it, then we would everything would be a disaster. Well, okay, that wouldn't make it false that we don't have free will because if we didn't, it would suck. That's not how, if I don't have $1 million, I can't say if I don't have $1 million, it would suck. Therefore I have $1 million that. So it wouldn't follow from that. I'm not saying you're reasoning that way or other people are reasoning that way, but it does concern me that people seem like they want to believe in free will. And I mean, it's probably the case. I got to admit that I don't want to believe in it because I kind of like, rejecting views like this. There's some appeal to me in that. I don't know why, but I am that way. But I guess that's my natural inclination to try to psychologize everything. What are our motives? Why we think about things? But I think those motives are relevant when we're thinking about these things. It looks like you are concerned if I have to think this, there's going to be these terrible consequences. I don't even get to do my laundry. And I have all these smelly clothes. So I don't want to believe that because I have stinky clothes.
Well, I actually don't think it's going to make a practical difference in most people's lives. But I don't care. What I mean is, even if someone convinces me philosophically that determinism is true, I'm going to say, well, thanks for that. I'm going to go on living the way that I feel, which is I have free will, right? It doesn't matter if it's seems to be the logical conclusion that determinism is true. I don't feel it in my everyday life, so I'm not going to live as if it's true. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm 100% on the same page with you. So I don't think that belief or disbelief in any particular view of free will is likely to have many practical implications for most people. Myself, it probably has some implications for some people. And we could get to talking about the psychological research. I haven't looked at it in 2 or 3 years, so I'm going to be a bit out of date on that research, but I'll do my best when we talk about it. But generally speaking, I don't think that people's abstract, high-level philosophical views, to the extent that they have them, make much of a practical difference in their everyday decisions and behaviors. So, and in fact, this is something I've for some reason, philosophers seem to think that everyone runs around committed to one or another. I'm not saying every philosopher thinks this, but like everybody's got kind of an implicit theory, and that drives their actions or their motives. And all these implicit theories happen to be the kinds of theories philosophers endorse. And I don't think most people don't have views on this. They don't know, they don't care. And it just doesn't really matter.
Okay, well, for society in general, I don't think it matters, but there is one way in which this topic is important to me, and that is regarding beliefs and ideas about God. Okay, because like there are Christians who believe that in the deterministic view, and it's basically like because like everything is determined, that means God has chosen certain people and he has not chosen other people, right? And then there are Christians like me who say, no, I believe that God loves everyone. He desires that all be saved. And therefore, like this is, there's an indeterminate state of affairs. Basically, it's not there. God has not determined things to progress in a certain way, but that there's, different things that can unfold based on human choices. And so to me, I think that does make a practical difference in the way that you think and live, or it can if you really adhere to those beliefs. And I've actually seen the practical outworking of, I would say a negative practical outworking in spirituality when people think in the deterministic way about God.
So if you're talking about like a Calvinist view, or somebody that's like, hey,
Yes.
I know I'm going to heaven and I know you're going to hell and that's the way it's going to be and nothing can change that. Is that the kind of view you're talking about?
Yes, but I mean, to be fair to Calvinists, they're not going to ever say to someone, I know you're going, you're going to be, I'm not going to say the hell word because y'all know I don't believe in hell, but that you're not going to be part of God's kingdom. You're not a chosen one. Like they're not going to tell anyone that because they're going to be hopeful that person is chosen. But it makes it kind of weird because like in the moment, you cannot really tell the person God loves you and wants you to be saved, right? Like if I'm a Calvinist, I can't really say to you, Lance, God really loves you and he wants you to be saved, because that might not be true. You might not be a chosen one, right? So that
Gotcha.
kind of makes that kind of makes a weird situation.
Sorry, yeah, just to be, I didn't mean to suggest that a Calvinist would in fact treat someone that way, or that they necessarily think that way, because of course I don't know that, and you certainly know much more about their perspectives and what they think and everything. I don't know if they would think that they know like they're certain of who's chosen and who's not. They might just say, I'm not sure. Maybe you are, maybe I am.
Right.
But there's still, I could see the kind of, if you had that perspective, I could imagine how that could have a certain kind of demoralizing or sort of like innervating effect on your motivation. If you're like, look, it's the way it is. So like there's a futility in your actions at a certain point. Is that a concern?
I think it's on one side for them, it's comforting because it's like, okay, if you're chosen and nothing's going to change. You know what I mean? Like you're going to be chosen no matter what. And so for you, it may be comforting, but then it's in your thinking about other people where it's just kind of like, well, it doesn't matter what that person does. It doesn't matter, nothing matters about what the other person does. They are either chosen or not chosen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I find it fairly persuasive that could have some psychological effects. I mean, I do have to stress though, that wouldn't make it false. How unpleasant our reactions to a view don't dictate whether that position is right or wrong or plausible or implausible or anything like that. Not that you've said otherwise, but
right.
It does concern me that people raise that point and then they don't develop on it. They don't say, well, that would make me feel bad if that were true, so it's not true. They don't say that, but there's often this kind of floating implication where someone's like, but here's an argument for this. And someone goes, yeah, but if that was true, that would be bad. Yeah, maybe it would. And it's almost like people want you to go, oh, well, never mind then. I guess I'm wrong because the consequences would be bad. It's weird. Why do people do that? But Yeah, it could
Yeah.
have some psychological consequences for people to disbelieve in free will. Um, Maybe there would be some benefits of people not believing in free will, and it could be very culturally specific and context specific. I don't know exactly what the outcomes would be. Um, I mean, I don't know. These are empirical questions, and we got to do the research on it.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said, just because it may not, be like good or pleasant, it doesn't mean it's not true. And I think that's kind of the position that, Calvinists take, is like, well, that is the way it is. And they do have, some scripture that supports their position. So, but I also, I feel like the majority of the Bible does not, you know, uh, support that position. So, uh, and since I'm depending more heavily on scripture than logical arguments for my understanding of reality, then that's I I I understand it as not a good way to view God and the world.
So I had a question for you related to this, which is
Mhm.
one of my concerns, and one of the things that motivated me to want to discuss this with you is, one of the biggest concerns I have with Christianity is the problem of divine hiddenness and just what appears to me to be the fact that I don't have any sufficient information that would compel me to believe in God or to accept Christianity. And as a result of that, a second point I would make is that I also don't think that all of my beliefs are under my voluntary control, either as a direct result of like I can just will myself to believe or disbelieve things, or as a result of the degree to which I can motivate, like I could work up the motivation to pursue certain sorts of inquiry or to find myself convinced by that inquiry. So I could go read a bunch of books or I could go reread the Bible 100 times. Even if I chose to do that, first of all, I don't think I could choose to do that. I think I wouldn't be able to do that. Um, and then second, even if I did, I'm not sure that I couldn't compel myself to be persuaded by it. So one of my concerns with the Christian worldview is that it looks like people are held morally accountable for beliefs that they can't choose to have or not have. They don't have choices in the matter. What do you think of that sort of concern?
Yeah, well, okay, I guess um I don't I it actually, this is bringing up a topic that's close to my heart, because there's the view of the I would they call it, well, it's the exclusivist view in Christianity, where only those who believe and confess Jesus as Lord have the like can be saved. Okay, and that's a very popular view among Christians, is that the only way to be saved is to actually believe in Jesus. And if you don't believe in Jesus, then there's no hope for you. Now, I think that view is wrong. Okay. So I think that, uh, you know, yeah, if you believe in Jesus, then you have assurance of salvation, meaning that's a surefire way to know that you're saved, is to trust in Jesus, believe in him, and you have a promise of eternal life. But I do believe that Jesus's salvation, like God's plan of salvation, is big enough to save everyone. And so there are people who may not believe. Maybe it's because they never heard the gospel. Maybe it's because they heard and they weren't convinced. Maybe it's you know whatever. There could be a myriad of reasons why. Maybe they were harmed in the church when they were little, and then they had a distaste for Jesus. So what I'm saying is that I believe that Jesus is able to save people who may not have, heard the gospel and trusted in him in the moment.
It does seem kind of strange though. Like why would God have created me? Like assuming God existed, why create me and then make me incapable of believing in God given the conditions that God himself set up? That seems weird. Doesn't God want me to believe in him and have a relationship with him? Why would he make me incapable of doing so?
Yeah, well, I think that that does assume a lot more action on God's part, like than like. So I think there's more than one influence going on in the world. I mean, you know, we have, okay, you've got your genetics, you've got your culture in which you're raised in, you've got, there's spiritual forces, spiritual beings in the world that don't want you to believe in God, that are actively coming against your belief in God or your potential for faith. You have your own fleshly desires that may keep you from God. So, that may keep you from actually turning to God. So there's like a whole bunch of things that can be influencing. And like God is not in control of all those things. He's actually limited his power in this world. And so he's given power to beings like you and me. And because of that, there's a lot of things that are factoring into to whether or not you believe. And I think it has, I don't hold God responsible for that.
Why would God do that? It just seems to me, I'm not even trying to disprove God or anything. It just seems strange. Just create a world, make some people able to believe, some people not, give some people direct revelatory experiences, some people not, have some people witness miracles, some people never see any, no matter how hard they look for them, have some people be psychologically constituted in ways that they're moved by the Bible and other people are just not. And sure, okay, so I'm buffeted by all the forces of culture and experience and the forces of light and darkness operating behind the scenes, the angels and the demons all over the place. Even assuming all of that is true, it could have been set up differently. God could show up like Jesus could just show up right here and be like, hey, I am real. Are you going to believe? Like, think about that. Cause like lots of people would see that. Boom, you got a bunch of believers. Why not? Why not do that? And, I've heard answers to why God wouldn't do that, where like to do something that would compel belief. And that would have an immediate transformative change in my life. I'm assuming you would think it would be good if, I was going for a walk one day and God started talking to me and was like, yo, I'm real, hopefully it'd be cooler than that. But, angels show up with some trumpets and they're like, God exists, you were dumb and wrong, like that would be fun. I would think God was funny and I would be a believer. And presumably like you would think that'd be wonderful if I was like, Rebecca, right. I saw angels and now I'm a believer. Like, let's go, go Jesus. Like I'm on team Jesus now. Presumably that you would think that would be great. Why doesn't God? Because God could do that right now. Why doesn't God do that? Why not?
Yeah, well, okay, that's a good question. And I will say, in like supporting what you're saying, I have heard a lot of testimonies of people for whom that did happen, that Jesus appeared to them and it was life-changing for them. I've never heard someone say, Jesus appeared to me, but I said, nah, like, so I think you're right that, those who have that experience, they are changed. And so, okay, so why isn't God doing that for everyone? Well, I don't know. But I do believe that each of us are on a journey and there's beauty in the journey. And so, like, we will all end up where we wanted to be. And so, if your desire is, if there's a God and he's good and he's beautiful and he's loving and you want to be part of his kingdom, and I believe that that's where you will end up. And so, I think that there are some people who won't. And, because even, Satan and some of the angels turned against God, even though they were in God's presence. So there are some people and some beings who don't want God as king. And so they won't be part of God's kingdom.
So I guess to go back to what we were getting earlier, I don't know if I got a straight answer in this. Maybe you're not able to give one. Am I doing something morally wrong if I don't believe in God? Like, if you fail to believe in God, you are doing something morally wrong.
Well, Lance, this is my opinion and people don't like it and they often get mad when I say it. But I think God has revealed enough of himself that everyone can know him, even if he doesn't appear to them. So I think he is revealed in nature. He's revealed in who you are. He's revealed in many ways in the beauty in this earth. And so to me, I don't see that, I do want to leave it open for like, okay, people who have had a traumatic experience, something like that. And maybe you have, I don't know. So I don't know. I can't say with definite for everyone's experience, but I do think God has revealed himself to you. Jesus has never appeared to me, but I have no problem believing in Jesus. So why do I have no problem believing in Jesus? He didn't ever appear to me.
Right. So I don't know the answers, but what if I'm just bad at interpreting evidence? Like, am I morally responsible for that? So like, you give me all this good evidence of God, and then I'm like, I don't really get it. Or I don't know. I read a bunch of science books or atheist books that I'm like, I'm not going to take that seriously. And, now I'm not good at reasoning. I'd like to believe it if it's true, but I can't because of my own, I don't know, emotional blocks or whatever it is. Is that, like, is it morally wrong for me to not believe it? It just seems weird to hold people morally accountable for their beliefs, especially if those beliefs are not voluntary. So like, the question to me, can I voluntarily choose to believe in God? Yes or no? I think a lot of Christians would say yes. And I think the answer is no, I can't. I don't think I could choose to believe in God. And then the question is, a couple questions. One would be, if I can't choose to believe in God, does it make sense to hold me morally responsible for not believing in God? And then the second is, what if I could choose and I choose not to? Am I still morally responsible? And if so, why? Like, what if I have good reasons to choose not to believe in God? And so there's sort of layers of issues that I have with the moralization of whether or not people believe in God.
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that Jesus describes Judgment Day entails much more than belief, right? So I think that, Lance, if you really can't believe in God, something in your psychology does not allow you to believe in God, then your actions on this earth will show which kingdom you actually wanted to belong to. So that when you do see Jesus on Judgment Day, and if you want to be part of his kingdom, then you will have been doing actions on this earth that show that you demonstrate that you wanted to be part of his kingdom. And I'm not just pulling this out of anywhere. I'm getting this from Matthew chapter 25. Jesus talks about the way he's going to judge the nations. And he says he's going to gather them together like a shepherd gathering and separating the sheep from the goats. And why were the sheep accepted? It doesn't say because you believed in me. Actually, the sheep are surprised in that scenario. The sheep are surprised when Jesus welcomes them. Okay, so Jesus said, come. He didn't say, come, you who believed. He said, come, you who are blessed by my Father and inherit the kingdom prepared for you. Because when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you invited me in. And it goes on. And then they say, Lord, when did we do that for you? And Jesus says, whenever you did this for the least of these, you did it for me. Okay, so here we're getting a picture. And then what happens to the goats? Jesus doesn't say to the goats, oh, you didn't believe, so no goodies for you. You're not getting in the kingdom. No, he didn't. It had nothing to do with their belief. He said, you are depart from me because you did not feed me when I was hungry. You did not clothe me when I was naked. You did not do these things for me. And they say, Lord, when didn't we do that for you? And he said, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you also did not do for me. So there's much more to Judgment Day. I don't think you're going to be judged just based on whether or not you believed, but also on what did your life look like? And so you're going to be judged based on what you've done. And so I think that opens up the potential. I'm not saying that those people who did good things, that's like they still needed Jesus to die on the cross for sins so that they could be healed of their sin and corruption. Because even if you're doing good deeds, you've still got the corruption in you that needs to be resolved and taken care of by Jesus. But it's just that by your actions, like, Jesus isn't stupid. You know what I mean? He's not like, he's not stupid. He knows what's going on in people's hearts and lives, right? So does that make sense?
It does. It raises question. Well, I mean, one would be whether how well supported your perspective is scripturally. So, it could just be like, what if you were convinced of scriptural readings that entail that you're just wrong about this and you have to believe? And it seems like would that raise questions to you about the morality of your belief system?
Well, this is something that yeah, absolutely. Because I don't think and this is why I said this topic is really, I think it's important. It's extremely important. And I think a lot of Christians are getting this wrong. Okay. And so I am passionate about sharing this because a lot of Christians are not, I think they're ignoring half of the Bible to support. Now, there are a few verses that say, if you don't believe, you're condemned and, blah, blah, blah. Okay. There are a few verses like that. But then you have many other passages of scripture, Old and New Testament, that say the righteous are going to have eternal life. That and even that Jesus came to bring good news to the poor. Okay, that God has promised to take care of the poor. So most of the poor who have ever lived on this earth never heard the gospel. So is God really serious about those promises to the poor? Jesus said, blessed are you who are poor. So how are the poor blessed if Jesus is going to judge them just based on what they believed or didn't believe about him? If they never heard the gospel, that is the situation for most of the poor who have ever lived. So what I'm saying is we can't ignore so many passages of scripture that promise that God is righteous and good and just, that he cares about the poor, that Jesus came to bring good news to the poor. If you have to believe in Jesus and confess Jesus's name in this life to be saved, then that means Jesus is actually bad news for the poor. Okay, so I don't believe Jesus is bad news for the poor. I believe he's good news for the poor and for the rest of the world. So, I think this issue is important because it does, it changes it changes whether or not Jesus is good news for the world. Is Jesus good news for the world or is Jesus bad news for the world? Because if Jesus is if this exclusive view is true that one must know and confess Jesus in this life, then that's actually bad news for the world because that means it got harder after he came to get saved. Does that make sense?
I mean, something makes sense. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but sure, I made sense of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to take this back to the free will stuff because I feel like, and this is totally due to me pushing the conversation in this direction, but one of the things I'm curious about is why you, and I don't know, sorry, another thing to say, I'm not sure we're going to get clear on a definition of free will. My impression is that you're probably not too keen on the compatibilist conceptions of free will, and that you endorse some other one. I don't know that we really want to get into trying to figure out a definition and do this conceptual analysis. I don't know if that would be fun or interesting, but one of the things I am curious about, and if you want to do that, I'll do that, but is why you believe in free will. Is it so at least a couple possibilities would be your phenomenology, because it seems like you reported that it seems to you experientially you have free will, but then there might also be a scriptural basis for it. But whatever, there's a couple possibilities, but why do you believe in free will?
Yeah, well, because, first of all, I would say a lot of it is experience based. right? Like I'm experiencing life as if I have free will. I feel that right now there are options before me in this 1 minute. There are options before me that I could choose from, and I don't feel that those are determined. But anyway, so yes, experience is a big part of it. But I do think that like it makes sense in my understanding of reality and the way that God interacts with people. You know, a lot of times God in the Bible is telling people like, if you do this, then this will happen. I'll bless you. But if you do this, then I'm not going to bless you. So, or this bad thing will happen. So if there's no real option about what's going to happen, then God is just playing a big game, right? Like he already knows and he's already determined it, and or whatever factors have determined it. So then like everything he's saying is just a big game, right? Like he doesn't really mean it. That means like God is like being insincere throughout the scripture. You know what I'm saying? So like if he's presenting options to people and he's kind of telling them what will happen if it goes either way, then there must be some opportunity for it to go either way. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, I gotcha. So that first one that you say, it feels like you have free will.
Yes.
What is the experience like?
Now, see, Lance, this is where I can get into it with you because you've shared before that you feel the opposite, and I just think, how is that possible that one feels that their actions are determined? Because I mean, what is that experience like? I feel like it's kind of silly to describe it because I think most people have that experience, right?
Well, what would it feel like if your decisions were determined?
I don't know.
So how do you know that that's not what it's like right now?
You're right. It's a good point. I don't know.
So you don't know what it would be like if it wasn't the way that you think it is. So how do you know it is the way you think it is and not the way you don't think it is?
It's a good point. I just have to leave it at that point because I don't know.
So that would be one of my concerns, which is that you
Right.
might think that if our actions are determined, that it would feel, or at least it could feel like they're determined. And one of the ways you might describe that is like, oh, you're just watching yourself do things. Like, oh, I'm not making choices. My arm is just doing a thing. That's one way it could feel if your actions were determined. But the thing is, if our actions are determined, in addition to that, it's not just like my arm is just doing a thing on its own. It's that I could think, hey, I'd like to pick up this can and I'd like to have a drink. All of those experiences that you have, if determinism is true, could themselves be determined. And so all of the experiences that you're having, even if determinism is true, the experience of feeling like you're making decisions and deliberating through, do I want to have this thing on the menu or that thing on the menu? Do I want to go to the store tomorrow or not go to the store tomorrow? All those psychological states, if they are the product of deterministic psychological processes, would themselves feel exactly the way that they currently feel to you. And so it seems to me that if determinism is true, your experience, there's like not a distinguishable difference in what your experiences would be like. So that's one consideration. The other, and it's not that I feel like my decisions are determined, but I do sometimes notice portions or elements of my experiences that do seem to be automated. And I like you're like, if you've ever been driving and talking to somebody, you could signal in your car and turn, and I'm not even deliberating or thinking through any of that. It's been pushed into my unconscious. And so a lot of our actions are already happening in some cases outside of conscious awareness. A lot of our psychological processes, we're not even attending to them when we're doing things. I mean, I'm sure you've been talking on the phone and walking at the same time, and you're like only attending to the conversation and don't even think. Like I could get through folding a whole stack of laundry and not even remember that I did it 5 minutes later because I wasn't even consciously attending to that fact. Did I choose to do that? Yes, but it didn't feel like I was acting out of free will. There was some part of my brain that's like, fold laundry while I'm talking on the phone. And so I think if we actually reflect on our phenomenology, like our subjective experience of what our decision-making is like, we'll notice a sort of gradient or a sort of a spectrum between actions that we're like more attentive to, and we have greater sort of self-awareness or mindfulness of those actions, and others where we're less mindful of them. And some of them seem like they're more a product of free will, and some of them seem like they're less a product of free will, to the extent that that's how we want to describe those experiences. So I think that's like a second point on this. And then the third point is, if you really are like mindful about your experiences, you might find that like a lot of the decisions you end up making might superficially seem like they're voluntary or you're choosing them. But if you really reflect, in some cases, you might find that those decisions actually kind of just seem to happen, and then you're noticing them. And so a lot of my when I've like really reflected on my experiences, a lot of them kind of seem that way. And so I don't have this straightforward experience that I am like the buck stops with me in terms of decision making, but rather that in many cases, my choices and my actions sort of bubble up out of the unconscious abyss of my mind and direct my actions in ways that I couldn't have anticipated. And in a certain sense, I am simply an observer too. That is what my experience is like. And I think, I also don't think that I'm like super psychologically idiosyncratic. I suspect I've just reflected on it and I've noticed this about my experiences. I suspect other people would if they reflect too. Maybe I'm wrong though. Could be people are very different from one another. I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think you're making some good points there. And so I can see what you mean about some processes feeling automated, and, and maybe it's more like that than I'm giving credit for in other areas. Now, do you want to, we've been going for an hour. Do you want to move over to your channel, or do you want to go into the talk about the like,
I could talk about some of the
tests and
research
stuff?
if you wanted to talk
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
Sure. Is this something we've talked about before?
We've talked about it a little bit before, yeah. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not super eager to hop over to my channel. I also am curious, should we address some of it looks like there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat.
Sure, we
And
can.
I also don't
Yeah.
know if anybody wants to talk or what they want to talk about. So we might want to figure both of those things out.
Okay, cool.
But that, it's totally up to you. It's your channel. You tell me what you want to do.
No, I want this talk to go the way you want. But so Peter says, if we don't choose according to antecedent factor like our nature and circumstances, is this free will being claimed completely arbitrary? Well, I guess this is a question for me. I don't know. Well, Lance, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I don't know what's meant by completely arbitrary. I mean, I kind of get the sense that if we have it sounds like they're asking a question like if there's a compatibilist conception of free will, is this kind of free will like arbitrary? Like, what's the point? What is it getting us? I mean, that's I'm not really sensitive to these kinds of considerations myself, because I just don't think whether we have free will or not is the right way to frame these sorts of actions. What I would say is, personally, I suspect that our actions are determined by antecedent causes. Maybe they're not. I think if they're not, that the only alternative that seems plausible to me is that there would be an element of randomness or indeterminacy to our actions. I don't know what I can't really make sense of libertarian conceptions of free will that deny both of those and think that we're like the ultimate source of our act. I don't know what they mean by that. And what little I've seen of those sorts of accounts end up getting into obscure metaphysics and terminology that I just don't understand. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but I don't even know what those positions amount to. And it often seems that if you reject those accounts, that you're left with, like one of the charges people might make of the compatibilist accounts is that they're giving you a kind of like a pseudo free will. It's like they're calling this something free will, but it's not really free will, because they're conceding determinism could be true, and you would still have this kind of free will. And the attitude some people have is, if determinism is true, you couldn't possibly have any kind of practically meaningful kind of free will. But a lot of that ends up being predicated on normative considerations, in some cases moral considerations, and in many cases considerations of value and meaning. And I have very different views on value, meaning, and morality than most people. And so a lot of these issues just don't really affect my position on these issues. So, for instance, one of the central disputes that people might have is they might say, if we don't have, like, never mind the determinism question, if we don't have any kind of free will, then we're not morally responsible, and therefore you're not justified in punishing people or blaming people. And I reject that entire framework. I don't really believe in that kind of moral responsibility, and I don't really believe in punishing or blaming people in this desert. I don't think you should punish people because they deserve to be punished. I reject that entire framework, and because I'm a moral anti-realist. My normative standards are going to come down to, on my position at least, my desires and values for what kind of world I want to live in. And people might see that as potentially horrifying and terrible, but at least one advantage of this view is that if it turns out we don't have free will, I don't think that we have to, let murderers run in the street killing people. I would just say, oh, I don't want them to, and that's good enough for me as a reason. So my position kind of just, it's like two ships passing. It just sails on by these concerns, and I'm just like, I don't care about any of these concerns. So it doesn't raise a problem for me, but it might raise a problem for people, given they might end up having commitments that are inconsistent with one another. And if they want to be in a state of reflective equilibrium, that is, if they want to have a logically consistent set of views about free will, determinism, morality, and meaning and value in life, something's got to give there. For me, I think the whole thing drops out. But other people, they might think, you can't have both, and then they got to give up something.
Okay. Well, so I've kind of scrolled through the chat, and there's just too much talk in there. Guys, if you have, but I'm not really finding good questions like regarding free will and determinism, but I can't go through the entire thing. But if you have like topics that you want to discuss about free will and determinism with Lance, in a little while, we're going to do a stream on his channel. We're going to just go over there, and then he's going to have an open stream. Anybody can join, and you can share your thoughts about free will. So please stick around for that. We're going to do one last thing right now, which is kind of discuss the research, because Lance has actually been, he's been involved with research and studying and basically different things related to this. So he has some things to share about what the actual research shows about related to this topic. So do you want to share that stuff?
Sure. Unfortunately, my answer is going to be fairly pessimistic. It seems like I'm just pessimistic about everything, although I suspect it's because I choose things that I expect to be pessimistic about, and then I'm like, exactly as expected. Like, I could go into some other area of research and find all kinds of wonderful things. But I just seem to focus on this stuff. Anyway, so in the past few years, I'd say 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, I don't know how long it's been, really. Researchers have started studying how non-philosophers think about free will. Now, one of the primary focuses of that research, and this is in an area called experimental philosophy, some of it is in kind of a social and personality psychology. A big focus there has been on this question that we talked about at the start, which is this compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And the question has been like, do people think free will is compatible with determinism? And they typically give people vignettes or these little scenarios, like little paragraph. Well, they'll say, imagine the universe is deterministic. If a person commits a terrible action in this universe, would they be morally responsible for their actions? And they try to look at what people think there. That research got really complicated really quickly because you get these really equivocal and messy responses where it's almost like 50-50 which way people tend to go. So it's just kind of unclear what people tend to think. And it gets really complicated. So for instance, in those cases, if you describe a very sort of morally neutral thing, like imagine the universe is deterministic and then this person doesn't report all their taxes properly or something in order to save money. Are they morally responsible? And then people are like, no, not really. But if you describe some horrible thing, like a person burns down their house and kills their children, then people are like, yeah, okay, they're morally responsible. And some people have proposed that there's this sort of affective bias or an emotional bias where if you're outraged, you're like, yeah, they're responsible. And then it seems like our judgments about whether people have free will or not are sensitive to biasing factors that really aren't reliable guides to whether people have free will or not. And so now we can start questioning this underlying psychological processes giving rise to our intuitions about free will. It's a whole complicated thing. But there's also been this other stream of research that is simply looking at, do people think they have free will or not? And that research, rather than giving people these sort of complicated scenarios or seeing whether they endorse compatibilism or not, instead is simply looking at to what extent do people believe in free will. And this research relies on a classical type of measures, Likert scales, where you give people a set of questions and then you just ask them, how much do you agree or disagree with these statements? And what they'll do is they might give people 5 statements or 7 statements or 10 statements. And I'm sure most people have filled out surveys before where you have a statement and then it's like 1 is strongly disagree, 4 neither agree nor disagree, 7 strongly agree. Could be 1 to 5 points on the scale, whatever. And in this research, and there's several different scales. There's the free will and determinism plus scale. There's the free will inventory. There's a couple, at least one new scale that came out. I know about a couple others. Some of them don't even have names, whatever. So these different sorts of scales, and some of them have been developed by psychologists, some of them by philosophers, and they ask a variety of questions about people's belief in free will. Now, what has this research shown? Well, the primary focus of this research has been to test whether or not there are correlations between the degree to which people believe in free will and various other psychological measures and behavioral measures of practical or scientific interest. And what a lot of this research seems to show is that when you ask people if they believe in free will, the lower their scores, the more sorts of bad things are associated with that. And the higher their scores, the more sorts of good things are associated with that. So, higher free will might be associated with I can't remember the list off the top of my head.
Laundry doing. No,
probably laundry doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably laundry. That might literally be one of the things that would be on the list. Could be. It's probably not in practice, but you could measure that. So it's like just all the good stuff. So greater psychological well-being, greater self-control, lower risk of having problems with addiction. So like all these greater job satisfaction, greater life satisfaction. But people are better able to manage their lives, and they put more effort into their work, and there's all sorts of positive benefits associated with believing in free will, and all these negative outcomes associated with not believing in free will, with very few like counterexamples. So there might be a couple cases where it flips, where less belief in free will is actually a better thing. Like you might be less punitive or something like that. Maybe that would be good. But overall, the picture seems to be belief in free will is extremely psychologically important for virtually every, not virtually every, but most measures or very many measures of like that you would want to find in a population. And this might raise the sort of worry that causing disbelief in free will or doubts about free will could have serious negative psychological consequences for the population at large. Now, you and I kind of have the sense that this wouldn't follow from this, but this research seems to indicate that this is true. Now, one of my concerns with this is that these scales have been introduced into multiple languages. They started to get it's sort of exploded as a sort of area of research. Now, it hasn't exploded as much as other really big areas of research, but it's spreading to different languages, and I'm seeing these free will scales being used more and more in different sorts of journals. I have serious problems with these scales. One of them being the sort of central problem is that they ask questions that are ambiguous in such a way that it's unclear whether agreement or disagreement is actually reflective of any sort of shared, conceptually clear construct that we can meaningfully refer to as free will. Now, I'll give a sort of straightforward version of one of these questions, and then we'll talk about like why that's a problem. Here would be one of the questions. I can't. In fact, I should pull up. I'm going to pull up one of these scales to actually look at the questions word for word.
Yeah, and while you're doing this, I just want to say, like, for those who don't know Lance, he has been working on his PhD at Cornell. So, he does have like a strong background in this research. And so it's really cool to be able to get his perspective and hear the results. So, and most of your research has been on metaethics in particular, which we've talked about that topic quite a lot on this channel, and you can find our previous discussions about morality throughout the channol. But yeah, did you find it?
Yes, I did. Okay. I'm just going through the list because I have a very large appendix of all the different measures. That's one measure. That's not a good one. Let me see. I want to get one of the newer scales, or one of the ones that's used more frequently. Is this?
And Big Thing Flying Wayne wants to know, Lance, where's your shelf of books that you've never read? You'll never read.
It's not in this room. Yeah, I do have a big shelf of books, most of which I have not read. I love that remark. Yeah, I was just talking to someone about, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. People like to get books, and I get all these books, and then I just don't even read half of them. But I do find that I do a little better with audiobooks. So I'm a big fan of getting audiobooks because I can get through those. But it's gotten increasingly difficult over the years for me to get through a book. I really feel like my attention has been hampered by the way modern technology works, like, cell phone, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have one of these scales.
Okay,
so I don't know if I should. Can I?
You can share it if you want. Yeah, just put the present and then.
I don't want to present. I just want. Is there a way for me to post it in the comments?
The link for it. Put it in the private chat, and I'll put it in the.
I don't want to link to the whole scale because it's like an appendix that I put together myself. I could just post some of the items. Here's one of them. And then maybe you could put it up on the screen. I don't know what the easiest way to do this would be.
Let's see. Okay, sure. Number one.
So here's one of the items. People have complete control over the decisions they make. So presumably, like the way that this item would be used is if you agree with this, that means you believe in free will. And if you disagree with this, that means you don't believe in free will. Is that a good measure of belief in free will?
No, because I believe in free will, but I wouldn't be able to say that I wouldn't say that this is true.
Well, why would you disagree with it?
Well, because there might be decisions that are coerced, or there might be decisions in which, people are they may have certain circumstances. Like if you ask me if a heroin addict has complete control over the decisions they make, I'm not going to say that that's true because, they, you know what I'm saying? Like there's chemical factors and things that might inhibit them making decisions. There might be, a mental problem that inhibits them making decisions. So I can't say it's absolutely true. Go ahead.
On a scale of 1 through 5, where 1 is you strongly disagree with this and 5 is you strongly agree with this, where would you land on that scale?
I would say 4.
Oh, so you do somewhat agree with this. So you would be picked up with as a measure of belief in free will. It would indicate, you are inclined towards free will.
Yeah.
So here's a few concerns I have, and I agree with the concerns that you raise. Mm-hmm. One of these is whether the agreement or disagreement seems to hinge on, for me, that term complete. Do you agree people have complete control over the decisions they make? Because I don't think people have complete control over the decisions they make. But I don't think that that's relevant to whether people have free will or not. I think people have control over some of the decisions they make, but they don't have complete control over the decisions they make.
Yeah, I think complete makes it a little bit, I think that makes it difficult to answer.
But you still indicated a 4. So I would pick a 1 on this or a 2.
Okay.
People would fall. So it seems to be picking up. I don't believe in free will and you do. So far, this seems like a pretty decent measure, at least as far as our responses go. But I do have concerns with this item. One of them is it hinging on complete or not. But what you could see is that there's also potentially interpretive variation between us. Like we read this to mean somewhat different things as one another. But the other thing is that on my view of free will, I don't think control over our decisions has anything to do with, I don't think it's that relevant to whether we have free will, because I think that it's consistent with not believing in free will to think that people have control over their actions. I just think that, I just don't think that that's what free will is about. Because I don't think if you're a determinist or you deny free will that you think people don't have control. One issue with this would be, is this asking a question with a compatibilist conception of free will or a libertarian conception of free will in mind? So a compatibilist might say that control over our actions is sufficient for free will, even if it's determined. But is this asking that question, or is it asking whether our actions are not determined? I don't know. Which one do you think it is? Do you think this is asking you basically whether determinism is true or false, and that if it's false, therefore that's why you have control over your actions? Or is this asking you whether people have control over their actions regardless of whether determinism is true?
Well, before I started talking to philosophers, I would have no idea about the compatibilist position or determinism at all. So I would completely assume that they're like, I would just assume this is like free will or not free will. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I
Yes,
wouldn't,
and isn't that a concern? So
yeah.
are we measuring belief in libertarian conception of free will, compatibilist conception of free will? How could we be measuring one or the other in particular if the question doesn't specify one or the other in particular? That it leaves the question sort of fundamentally ambiguous.
Well, I wonder though, is it a problem with okay, and I agree that this is ambiguous, but at the same time, like, is it possible that philosophers are just greatly overcomplicating things? I mean, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just this is one of my complaints about philosophy is that like there's just such like deep and like arguments about the meanings of words, and it's just exhausting. So I don't know. I
I
feel
don't
like
know either, but
like
it just seems like it's hard to know what. Here's a simple way to put it. I don't know whether agreement. I don't know what a response to this question would mean. It seems to me completely consistent with someone that denies free will to agree with this, although that doesn't strike me as very likely. But primarily, it seems to me possible for a person that believes in free will to disagree with this. A person can say, look, I think we have free will, but I don't think we have complete control over the decisions we make. Sometimes
right,
we don't have control. So that means we don't have complete control, period. So I disagree.
right,
One. And that just seems completely
yes,
compatible with not believing in free will, or sorry,
yeah,
with believing in free will. So
right,
both agreement and disagreement with this seem consistent with believing in free will. And so I don't know what proportion of people that on reflection, if you had a long conversation and they're like, yeah, it turns out I did believe in free will. What proportion of those people would have disagreed with this if they had been given it the question without really thinking or reflecting on it? I don't know. And I don't know if these researchers know. And I don't know how you would do that without some other measure of free will, which this scale itself doesn't have. But let's not dwell on this too much. Let's look at the next question. Here's number two. I just
good,
posted it in the
good.
chat.
And we can do kind of an unofficial test on it, right?
Yeah, let's see. So everyone in the chat that wants to, you could rate whether you agree, strongly disagree, through neither agree nor disagree.
Scale to 1 to 5, right?
To 5, yeah, to 5 is strongly agree.
Okay, people must take full responsibility for any bad choices they make. I'd score it as a 4.
So if you disagree with this, does that mean you don't believe in free will?
No, because I think you're going to score this high and you don't necessarily believe in free will, right? Like, I don't know. What are you going to score? What are you going to say? Do you agree?
Another a 1 for me. They must. What does that mean? They must take full responsibility. What does that even mean? And also, it doesn't even say moral choices. So I make a bad choice. I have to take responsibility for it. Why? And which people? Like if children make bad choices, must they take full responsibility? What about people that lack agency for some other reason?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think people should always like that. I don't think people must take full responsibility. That's a very strong claim. It might be that and for any bad choices they make. So literally, if you ever make any bad choice, you must take, without exception, you must take full responsibility. That part of that seems like a kind of like a practical or a normative question. Like maybe I think a society would be a good one if people like chose to, and this is something that philosophers that reject free will talk about, is like take charge responsibility. So I think it might be good or character building for a person to take responsibility for the bad choices they make. But I don't think that has anything to do with free will. And is that the type of responsibility that this is asking about? Or is this asking about desert-based conceptions of responsibility? Because the central dispute in philosophy about whether we have free will is whether we have the kind of agency such that we would deserve praise or blame for our actions. Is this asking about a desert-based conception of responsibility? Or is it asking about take charge responsibility or some type of practical conception of responsibility that is consistent with denying free will? I don't know. It doesn't specify. Now, you might think I'm overcomplicating things. Now, uh, but that's that. I mean, the question is, philosophers want to know whether or not people endorse a particular philosophical position. Isn't it incumbent on them, if they want to ask that question, to be clear about what philosophical position they're asking about? This question is simply not disambiguating a variety of conceptual distinctions that it would be necessary for a person to make in order for their answer to illuminate their position on free will, given some technical specification of what's meant by it. So, for instance, if a philosopher intends to measure whether or not a person responding to this question believes that people deserve praise and blame for their actions, independent of practical or like pragmatic considerations, like whether it would be useful to punish them or not. No, whether they really deserve punishment or not. Is this the kind of responsibility that that's asking about or not? There's no way to know. And there's no way to know, independent of like a bunch of extra research, how participants in a study are interpreting this. We don't know what they mean by, like, one issue with this is like, there's all these words that they're throwing in there: responsibility, bad choices, must, take full, like full responsibility. So all these terms: must, full, responsibility, bad, choices. Each one of those, people could have different interpretations and different philosophical positions on the meanings and implications of each one of those terms. And this could mean that each person taking this, if they have slightly different conceptions of each, or of one or the other of those terms, would have slightly different interpretations of what they're being asked. And so you could get a whole pattern of responses where each person's response, each person actually has the same view, but all of their responses are reflective of their particular interpretation of the question. And so what you're getting is the distribution of responses reflect how people interpret the question, not what their position is on free will. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Now let's do, since we're doing an informal little questionnaire here. Look, for the people in the chat who put, there were two answers that were given in the chat: Theophilus and believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Theophilus put a 4, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ put a 5. So now we'd like to know what you meant by that. I mean, we'd like to know overall what your position is. Do you generally believe in free will? So, all right, let's do the next one, and I'll come back and give their answers later if they put their answers.
I'm gonna skip ahead to my favorite item on this scale.
Okay, cool.
All right, be prepared for this one. It's up.
Strength of mind can always overcome the body's desires. This does not seem to have to do with free will. Right?
Well, do you agree or disagree? Does strength of mind, can it always overcome the body's desires?
I'm going to give this one a 2.
I don't even know how to answer the question. I don't think my body has desires. What does that mean? Does it mean like the rest of my body other than my mind? Or is it inclusive of it? What the heck is that asking me?
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, this is like some like pre-scientific conception of minds and bodies as distinct things, and like the rest of your body other than your brain has desires and they compete, like your heart and your liver, and they're like all competing to make, what the heck? But it seems to be talking about like some kind of conception of willpower, like the ability for me to override certain types of, I guess you could say, like base impulses. Like if I'm really hungry or I'm really angry, do I have the mental power to suppress impulses and control my actions? What does that have to do with free will? I just don't know what that has to do with free will. I think this just isn't related to free will.
That is a weird question. That's
it's weird, right?
Weird question.
So
yeah, very weird. Very weird.
I'll quickly show some of the other.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess it is my favorite question, but we're kind of skipping over it because it's like, do you have more to say on this one?
No, I mean, I think you made a really good point about what are they talking about with like body mind differentiation, because I mean, obviously, like if you have a desire for food or something like that, yeah, it's involving your body, but it's still in your mind, right? So it's just very bizarre. Like, but yeah.
It seems like it's talking about the ability to suppress impulses, and that's like a psychological question or something. It just doesn't seem like a question about whether we have a
Right.
certain kind of agency such that we're able to make decisions in a way where we're capable of being subject to like a legitimate praise and blame or something. It just doesn't seem related to that.
Right.
Should I give another question?
Sure. And some people put threes in here. And Jake, for the previous question, had put a 4.5.
You can't do 4.5. It's got to be one of the numbers. Because imagine you're filling this out online. You got to pick a 4 or 5. That's another
Okay.
problem with these kinds of studies, is that like there's some degree of resolution loss in your level of agreement.
Well, clearly he thinks it's high, but he says free will doesn't exist. Okay, I don't know if he's just being silly here,
I don't
but
know.
cannot choose to die. Okay.
Let me give another one of these that I think is pretty
Okay.
bad. So here's another item on the scale.
People can overcome any obstacles if they truly want to. Now, this one has nothing to do with free will, right? Because we don't know what they're talking about with obstacles. I mean, you might be like, have like, there could be like physical constraints that stop you from overcoming, right? Like I wouldn't know how to answer this.
This seems like a question about like optimism or belief in like self-efficacy. So it seems like it's asking a question like, do you think people have like the ability or the power to achieve their goals no matter what problems they face? Let's say you say yes to that. What does that have to do with free will? That's not what free will is about. Free will isn't about succeeding no matter what the obstacles are, because like, look, I can act of my own free will to like try to win a battle and then lose the battle, right? Like, even if I chose, like like free will doesn't guarantee success, does it? Like, that's not how I conceptualize it.
No. And I would put a 1 on this one, because there's no, there's too many different things that could stop someone from overcoming. But like you said, this isn't even about free will. It's kind of
right. So it's not just that I would like, I disagree with this, but also I just don't even see what agreement or disagreement has to do with whether or not you have free will with this particular question. The question seems to be indicating that it's like, do you believe people can literally achieve anything no matter how difficult it is, if they have sufficient desire to do so? Like, it's almost like it's just asking straightforwardly, is desire sufficient to achieve a goal? No. Like,
right.
What kind of question is that? Now, I would see that if someone says you could do anything you want to. I don't think when people say that they literally mean it. I mean, they certainly don't mean literally anything, because, okay, well, I want to jump over the moon. I can't. Sorry. I want to teleport. I want time travel powers. I can't choose any of that. So I can't do anything I want to. Often I think that that's a way of expressing optimism about a person's prospects. And it's intended to encourage a person and say, look, pursue your dreams, do the things you love, act in accordance with your values, be your authentic self. And those are all, nice things to encourage people to do. But to use a statement that seems like it's an expressive rather than like a literal statement about like optimism about achieving your dreams or whatever, and then treat almost like a metaphorical or non-literal remark as a measure of free will when it doesn't even seem related to free will, just strikes me as profoundly strange. And you'll find I'll post the other 3 items from the scale. I'll put all of them in here so people can see the rest of the scale. In fact, I'll just post the whole scale if it'll let me.
Wait, now, is this the study, though, that you were telling us about, where there was a positive correlation between free will and believing in free will and like having, good interactions in society?
This isn't a study. This is a scale that's used by many of those studies. And there's a bunch of different studies.
Okay. So then shouldn't we throw out that result about the correlation between belief and free will? And now that we know that this is the scale that they're using and it doesn't seem like it's a good measure, then shouldn't we not trust the results of the correlation?
So that's my inclination. Yeah, that's kind of the point. Is I'm skeptical of these findings, like the correlations, because if the measure of free will isn't actually capturing any sort of reliable systematic construct, then why should we think that we've identified a correlation between belief in free will and whatever this other construct is, if it's unclear what these items are measuring? Now, when people design these sorts of scales, they use various sorts of statistical procedures to demonstrate the reliability of the scale. And so they might report a Cronbach's alpha, they might do factor analysis, and they might report other sorts of statistical measures that would indicate things like that, or purport to indicate things about the reliability of the scale and the sort of conceptual relatedness of the items. And what you might find is that, for instance, the way that people respond to any one of the questions on this scale is predictive of the way that they respond to the other questions on the scale, in a way where it would make sense to see their responses to this set of questions as conceptually related. It would appear that they're measuring the same thing if people's answers to the questions tend to be very similar. In other words, if I know your answer to question one, I'm gonna have pretty good insight into your answers to the rest of the questions, and the same would hold for the rest of them. And the researchers that devise these skills, they have reported these sorts of measures, and the way that people answer question one does do a pretty good job of indicating how they'd answer the rest of the questions. And the same would hold for the rest of the items on the scale. In fact, they tend to drop items that don't have those characteristics. And so at the very least, people respond to this cluster of questions in a predictable way, where it's not like their answers to one question are random or unrelated with respect to their answers to other questions. And that is typically taken to be an indication of the internal consistency of the scale. And that is supposed to be at least one piece of evidence that would indicate that this is measuring what it's intended to measure. The problem with that is that consistency alone is largely relying on a kind of coherentist framework for understanding your knowledge about the set of items in question. And one problem with this is simply because the answers to a set of questions are similar to one another, it does not mean that they're measuring the thing that you intend to measure. And here's a thought experiment I could give you to illustrate why that's not true. Imagine I gave you the following set of questions. And just imagine how you would answer these questions. I show you a photo of a banana, and I ask you, is this this is a banana, agree, disagree? Would you agree or disagree? Assuming it's a photo of a
Agree.
banana. Okay, I show you another photo of a banana, agree, disagree?
Agree.
I show you a drawing, like a painting of a banana, agree, disagree? Is it a banana?
Agree.
So I keep asking questions like that, and you agree with all of them. Would your answers to those questions be consistent? Yes, you're agreeing with all of them, right? Now, what if I told you that that's a measure of whether you agree that atheism is true? And you agreed with all of them, so that means you agree atheism is true.
No.
That would be ridiculous, right?
Right.
And so how well the items predict one another doesn't tell you how well they predict the thing that you're trying to measure. And so you would need to have additional reasons beyond the consistency of the items to demonstrate that they measure what you're intending to measure. Now, one of the things you might then look at, that researchers would want to look at, is the predictive validity of the items. So what that means is, do people's measures on these scales predict the things that we would expect them to be associated with, to allow us to predict? To give a kind of intuitive example, if I gave a measure of like belief in Christianity, you would expect that, if not a perfect prediction, it would predict whether or not you would go to church, or, I don't know, read the Bible or something like that,
right.
Such that it doesn't mean that if you say you're a Christian in my measure, that necessarily you go to church. It's just that on average, people that agree with a bunch of like, imagine I use a question like this: Jesus is Lord, or Jesus died for our sins. Agree, disagree? Would you agree or disagree?
Agree.
And I would disagree with that. And that would probably be a decent predictor of whether or not we go to church. So it would have predictive validity in the sense that you could use our measures or responses to the question to predict our real world behavior in a way that's consistent with the conclusion that we're really measuring belief in Christianity. And that would be very reasonable. You might go to church or pray or do other things that would indicate you believe in Christianity, and I wouldn't. So it would be an accurate measure, probably. It'd be really weird if Jesus died for our sins had nothing to do with predicting if someone was Christian or not. It'd be ridiculous, right? So sure, that's going to work out to be a good measure. Now, in this case, we have all these measures of belief in free will. Does it predict the behavior we would expect to be associated with belief in free will? Well, that raises an interesting question. What behavior do we expect to be associated with belief in free will? That seems contestable. I don't think belief in free will is going to lead to better behavior rather than worse behavior. How would we know that it is associated with that? Like, these measures are intended, like, you can't use the initial measures that are finding these correlations. They're almost like exploratory correlations as indications of their predictive validity, when the very thing that one could contest is whether or not that's what you would expect to predict. So again, it doesn't seem like a good way of establishing the validity of these measures to show that they're really measuring free will. So ultimately, my position on this matter is that what you need is what I would call, and I don't know if there's terminology in the psychological literature that I'm not aware of. I haven't gone back and read the past 100 years of psychological literature, but I would call it interpretive validity. What you would need to show is that the participants in these studies are interpreting the questions in the way that the researchers intend for them to be interpreted. And that requires the researchers to have a clear conception of what it is, how it is they expect them to be, the questions to be interpreted. And I think that they're going to run into two problems. One is the papers that are measuring belief in free will don't seem to offer particularly clear conceptualization. You could call it an operationalization. What is it they're trying to measure? Belief in free will. Okay, well, what is free will? When I talk about this in my work, I say that free will as a term is a piece of technical jargon that was created by philosophers that reflects the term is used as a kind of placeholder for an ongoing dispute that is ironically about what free will is. It's not like in the case of in a lot of other disputes that we might have. Now, some people would dispute what God is, but for the most part, there's a lot of overlap in what people think God is. And the question largely is between atheists and theists and agnostics about, does God exist or not? Can we know God exists or not? You don't have people saying, well, I think God is a banana, and someone going, I think God is like, it's not ridiculous like that. God is this omnipotent being that created the universe and yada, yada. We can all agree on the definition or something close approximating it. And then we just dispute, does it exist or not? Can we know if it exists or not? But that's not the case of free will. In the case of free will, it's not like everyone agrees on what free will is, and then we're arguing whether we have it or not. Actually, the central dispute is, what is free will? Is it the sort of, can we conceptualize it as a special type of agency we have free will so long as our actions are consistent with our desires or goals? Or is it a responsiveness to reasons? Is it a certain kind of control over our actions that stems from a certain type of deliberative or reasoning processes? Or is it this kind of capacity that has certain sorts of metaphysical implications for our actions being the ultimate source of like our will, or ourselves being the ultimate source of our actions? Or, is it this requirement that certain actions are made under conditions in which we could have done otherwise in certain sort of metaphysically heavy way? Everyone is disputing that. So how can you measure free will? What is it? Which conception of free will are you measuring? Which one? So what free will is a contested concept, and we have all these different conceptions that are very different from one another. They have different metaphysical implications. They have different epistemic considerations. They factor in different sorts of psychological considerations. They have all sorts of different implications and conceptualizations. And so you can't measure belief in free will. You can only measure belief in some form of free will, like this conception or that conception. For instance, are these scales measuring compatibilist conceptions of free will or incompatibilist conceptions of free will? And someone could say, oh, well, the measures are just neutral with respect to that. It's just measuring whether they believe in either one of those or neither of those. But the questions you would ask to measure in an incompatibilist conception or a libertarian conception of free will are potentially different from the questions you would ask to measure a compatibilist conception of free will. Why think you could use the same questions to measure two different conceptions of free will? Why think that? Those are different conceptions. And so none of this seems to be factored into how these questions are designed or measured or thought about at all. So that's that's just one problem, which is it's unclear what these items are intended to measure. You have a second problem. Whatever you're intending to measure, it still requires participants. In order for your measure to be a valid measure of whatever it is you intend, your participants, the vast majority of your participants, must consistently and reliably interpret all of your questions in such a way that their answers are genuinely reflective of their position towards the intended interpretation. They have to interpret the questions as intended. And so you both have to have a clear conception of how they're intended to be interpreted, and you would have to know that people are interpreting them in the way that you intend. And when you ask really ambiguous and odd questions like this, it's unclear what you're measuring, and it's unclear how people are interpreting the questions. And so I have very little confidence that we know what we're measuring here.
Wow. Well, yeah, like I was thinking about another problem with the results that you mentioned about like that they found that people who believe in free will, let's assume that the conception is like the same conception that the survey builders had in mind is the conception that the person, has in mind. Let's say there's no ambiguity, just supposing for a moment that the same conception is in mind. If, we get positive results that, okay, the people who marked high on this survey for free will also tend to be better people in society, less crime, more, productive at work and all these things. And then that the conclusion is made that, okay, because they believe in free will, like the conclusion is made that people who believe in free will, end up doing better in life or something like that. That is like assuming that the belief participated in that rather than, you don't know which actually came first. Like, is it just that actually people who tend to do better in life, because for whatever, maybe they didn't have the same obstacles as the other people, right? Yeah, as the criminal. So maybe the people who don't commit crimes and go to work every day end up forming this belief about free will. And the people who commit crimes end up forming a belief that they don't have free will. So you don't know if the belief affected the person or if the person's circumstances affected their belief.
You're absolutely right. So what you're pointing to would be the very common problem that some people make the mistake of, which is inferring causation from a correlation. Now, correlations don't necessarily entail any particular causal relation between any set of variables. So there could be any number of causal relations. There could be a bidirectional causal relation. It could be that there's a third variable that causes two things to both correlate with one another. There's all sorts of possible causal things. Now, I should say the psychologists and the philosophers in question are not making that mistake. They are not thinking that if we find a correlation between belief in free will and positive outcomes, that therefore we may automatically infer that the belief in free will is causing the positive outcomes. They're not making that mistake. They are noting the correlation, though, and that does raise the possibility that increased belief in free will is causally responsible for at least some of these positive outcomes. Now, there's another line of research that I did not bring up that does attempt to experimentally manipulate degree of belief in free will and then test people's behavior or test the consequences of changes to belief in free will. And what that research purports to show is that if you can induce reduced belief in free will, that this causes negative behavioral consequences, that it causes worse behavior. Now, some concerns with that research is that some of the central studies that have been conducted didn't replicate, meaning that subsequent attempts to test participants using similar stimuli did not yield the same results. And so that may be an indication that some of those findings are like they're not real. They're like that the effect is not really there. That reducing belief in free will causes these sorts of problems. But this is yet again a case where I have a problem with the measures that were used, which is that I don't believe that these studies successfully manipulated disbelief in free will in the first place. And I actually have those measures. I actually have those manipulations here. So basically,
cool.
Let me go up to those.
You want to pull them up? Okay.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I could post. Let me see if I could. I might have a link I could give people. No, it's like linking to a PDF. That's weird. I don't want to give people that. I'll see if I could find this somewhere. Yeah, it's.
Well, why don't we do that? Why don't we go over? Do you want to go over to your channel?
Sure, I can pop over to my channel. I'd like to take a break real quick. So I'd like to get a drink and refresh and like let my mind reset. But let me see if I could find a link to this thing so people can read this real quick. So let me set this up in advance. So
Okay.
just to explain what I did, so then I could give people something to do while I go take a little quick break and we move over to my channel. Are you coming over to my channel too?
I will come over to your channel.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. But I will also take a little break. But yeah, but I'll be over there shortly. But I just want it for those who didn't hear the announcement and weren't here at the beginning. Lance started his own channel. This is going to be the first video on his channel. The stream link that I put that I pinned at the top of this, and I'll put it again in the chat now. But this is if you want to come over to Lance's new channel and join the stream. And okay, this is the stream link, and the link to Lance's channel, I'm going to put that up now also, if you just want to come and be in the chat. And Lance will appreciate your support if you subscribe to his new channel. So this is going to be the first thing on his channel. We're going to go over there and continue the discussion, but let people come in and talk with us. So please come over to those links. Thanks for being with us. And we'll see you guys over there. And if anybody doesn't see it in the chat after this ends, the link is down in the description of the video. So you can check that for the same link. Okay. So thank you so much, Lance. This has been awesome. And so you want to say 10 minutes from now?
Yeah, I'll get that going. But just as a warning, I haven't done this before, so there's probably going to be some technical issues. But are you going to be able to walk me through those?
Yeah, just let me in, and we'll figure it out. Yep, I'll go to that link. Yeah,
I literally am not even sure how we're doing this now. Am I leaving here and going over there?
Yeah, I'm going to end the broadcast. Then we're going to leave, and then we're going to go. You take your break, and then go over to your channel, and then you can let people in. And I mean, you can start the broadcast and then let people in, or you can let people in and then start the broadcast. So thanks for being here. And please check out Lance's blog, channel, website. And it was a great discussion. So see you guys.